observations of the what I call a cultural heritage context of commemorating and memorializing, and I'll talk about all these terms here in a second. Race riots and race massacres, mostly in Illinois. We'll end up talking about Illinois. I will base some of my general framework on Tulsa and its ongoing commemoration in 1921. Race massacre kind of as a base, and then we'll work our way up here to Springfield. So I will wrap up early enough. I will probably mention a lot of things. I'll kind of breeze through a couple of things, certainly focus on a few things. Those things I breeze through, hopefully you will maybe have a comment or question about them. Of course, anything else that I touch on or don't touch on for a little Q&A at the end. My lead image here is from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, Equal Justice Initiative, where they feature one of the murders here in Springfield in 1908, William Donning. So since this is a research presentation, some of my research questions and frameworks here. Don't worry, there's not a lot of text I'm going to read at you on the presentation. This one I will. What is the relationship between official public memorialization, talk about what that means, and, for lack of a better term, vernacular or community memory practices? Where are the lines of tension, synthesis, or collaboration, both that are obvious or possible? And that is speaking historically in terms of the history of commemoration and ongoing commemorative memorialization practices. And then somewhere down the line, as I'm working towards something a little more comprehensive, what are the possibilities and limitations imposed by cultural heritage tourism industries? I don't know about some of those phrases, but that's what I'm working with now. Like I said, kind of a working progress. So geographic and chronological focuses, like I said, mostly looking at Illinois in the end run here, but placing it in a larger national, even global context of commemorating, memorializing collective trauma. Chronologically, I'm interested in the history of commemoration. So how were things memorialized, commemorated in 1920, 1930, 1980, 1995? Thinking as a historian across time, but also rooting myself in the present and the contemporary, looking at how we today interpret and commemorate and memorialize the past. So a little bit all over the place. So I always like to start really any presentation like this. Definitions, disclaimers, caveats. Terminology. I'll be using the terms riot and massacre, not interchangeably. I will do my best to honor sort of the preferred terminology from any given place or time. This varies, as you'll see. We have the Tulsa Race Massacre, which was commonly referred to as a riot, but is now commonly referred to as a massacre. Whereas other places are still having this conversation, or not, about naming these events. So, happy to have that discussion as well, Q&A, thoughts about that. Lynching, I'll talk a little bit about lynching. I'll mostly focus on race massacres and riots right now. But when I do reference a lynching or two, if I do, moving on to the idea that lynching is just, a hanging. Right, lynching is kind of an extrajudicial terror killing in this case. Commemoration, memorialization, I've already used those interchangeably. They're not obviously the same word and have different implications. I think commemoration is a little more neutral in its tone, not as pointed as memorialization. Memorialization specifically memorializing death in this case. So some of these things I'll talk about use both terms, neither interchangeably. Increasingly, I'm using the term memorialization for some of these public memory commemorations. So what about public memory? Public memory generally, and this is a little bit in the literature that I'll talk about, is more kind of institutional, official memory, commemoration, memorialization, things that have sort of the support or the organizing kind of framework of museums, historical organizations, government, things like this, large nonprofits, grant funded, that sort of thing. I don't want to call it official memory because I don't want to have too much of a emphasis on any kind of like standard interpretation. And counter to that, sometimes complementary, sometimes as part of the public memory, what I call more vernacular or community memory. Sometimes grassroots, sometimes smaller organizations, like I mentioned, sometimes in opposition to the more public memory, other times kind of feeding into it. On my own position here in terms of both a public historian in the academy and a oftentimes practicing public historian, obviously I am not a member of the most impacted descendant community for anti-Black terror in Illinois. Right, I'm a white guy, I'm an academic, I'm not from Springfield, I've been here 10 years. So that's an important part of the positionality that we'll talk about. I'm also involved in some of these memorializing / commemorative practices, and I'll try to make that clear, especially when we get towards the end and talk about Springfield, indicate what efforts I've been involved in beyond just observing, sometimes a little bit of both. So I'll talk. Descendants and descendant communities, important. Trying to, like a lot of people, I'm trying to get away from the word stakeholders. It's really vague and strange, but different kind of stakeholders here in some of these issues and themes and practices. We can look at descendants several different ways. So if we look at a direct descendant of one of these events, this is someone who is family for the most part. Direct descendant, someone's great, whatever, great nephew or grandson, granddaughter, someone who was impacted directly, their direct descendant who's living. So that's the most direct descendant. We also have descendant communities. So what is the community presently that is most impacted by the history and legacy of this event? Right. So I make this distinction by thinking about, I can't think of the name of the author right now, an archaeologist who was working in some of the Colorado labor wars of the 19 teens, doing archaeology there. And they identify kind of distinctions between descendant communities. So the descendant community of those strikers in Colorado from 1919 or whatever, who were shot down by the National Guard and militia, right? Their direct descendants, they were mostly European immigrants at the time. Their direct descendants are scattered around. They're mostly middle class. They live in Southern California. They live in upstate New York. They're not coal miners. So that's a descendant community. Another descendant community in that case were workers in Colorado who were mostly Mexican American, right? Because they identify as the working class who are dealing with some of these issues. So there's two different kinds of descendant communities. Direct descendants as well, this impact. So another a personal example of this. Not all descendants are the same. I'm a descendant of a lynching, right? My great-great-great-grandfather was lynched. This was a political lynching. There was racial overtones in Texas, 1862. He was a Union supporter. And he was hanged in Gainesville, Texas. So I'm a direct descendant of a lynching. But I'm not a member of the descendant community for 1908 Springfield race riot in that way. When I think about and hear about my great whatever being lynched, it's kind of an interesting story. It's a different impact. A few contexts before we look at some examples. Scholars, both mostly not historians, it's starting to get a little more traction. A lot of the scholarship comes out of places like cultural anthropology, American studies, places like this. But there is a kind of a body of literature about some of these issues, how collective trauma is commemorated and memorialized. In the United States, most of this we see in case studies of sites of enslavement, plantations, right? Scholars have been writing about that, placing that in context of larger American historiography and in public history as well. The special genre of memorial museums. Memorial museums are museums that memorialize trauma. Think of a Holocaust. Right? These have been around a long time, but really kind of came to their own as a specific genre of museum in the 1970s, 1980s, ongoing around the world, not just the United States. In fact, the United States has been a slow adopter when you look at the global context of memorial museums. Alongside that, the idea of reparative public memory, truth and reconciliation commission, South Africa, South America, few Asian countries, slowly, again, the United States has been slow to kind of adopt this idea of truth and reconciliation, grappling with historical, oftentimes political, racial trauma. Sometimes this is an official government project. Sometimes it's a little extra official. There's a lot of literature about this in through places like that, right? And of course, South Africa. And the verdict is kind of mixed on the effectiveness of these truth and reconciliation, and a lot of times they're associated with memorial museums and how effective they are at achieving equity and justice in these places. So a few people have written about this. Marita Sturkin, who has written about trauma heritage, calls it. And then more recently, Liv Sachenko, who had a book out 2022 about public history in the post-truth world. So really kind of looking at the long history of these truth and reconciliation efforts, reparative public memory, and kind of looking at what's next. We've had a whole generation plus of these efforts, so what's next? Also literature, longstanding body of literature, mostly from cultural anthropology, on cultural heritage tourism. The anthropologist Ed Bruner, the anthropologist there, looking at tourism and giving a little more nuanced look as a field of study beyond just a capitalistic voyeur voyage. Kathy Stanton's work on Lowell, Massachusetts, the national park there, and then more recently, Katrina Phillips' book, Staging Indigeneity. Again, kind of looking at both the limits that cultural heritage tourism and capitalism imposes on some of these emerging efforts to deal with difficult pasts. That's certainly limiting, right? But there's some intriguing possibilities that I think are emerging in some of that conversation. Other important things. So as like I said, mostly we read a lot of anthropologists, American studies. But we read some historians, particularly one very important historian, Michel Riots, whose book cover here, Silence in the Past, from 1995, probably the most assigned book for public history grad students here in the United States. It is a long-standing classic and is standing the test of time. So the idea of silence as an historical narrative, Riots' big contribution here, is that silences, it's an active process. It's not just the act of not saying something. It's oftentimes the act of saying something else to avoid talking about other things, right? And silencing of the historical narrative, or silences in the historical narrative, is in itself a historical process, embedded in whatever's going on at that time, right? So they don't just happen naturally. So this is provide a framework for a lot of American scholars dealing with these issues. They're going to constantly cite Trio. Other things, a couple of things. One is the idea of shared authority. This is more of a practice, methodological thing in terms of how public history is made. The idea of shared authority. This comes out of the oral history theory in practice, to where you sit down for an oral history interview with someone. That authority is shared between the interviewer and interviewee. So it's not just a matter of, there's certainly some power dynamics at play, but there's a give and take. So public historians have kind of taken that and expanded it to think about collaborative practice more broadly speaking, where authority is shared between the academic expert, the institutional public historian, and the community, and something kind of in between emerges. So there's a lot of case studies about that from the field, and collaborative public history, ideas of like co-creation, consultation, and all this. Related to that, the literature on decolonization, which is key to understanding how some of these consultation and community collaborations are emerging more recently, taking kind of a framework from the field of museum studies with decolonization, to where you have a more authentic, from the ground up, not even power sharing, but power granting to descendant communities, in this case, indigenous communities. And that is part of kind of trauma-informed humanities and public history practice, which is getting more and more prevalence. Some notable examples: Finding Ceremony, which is out of Philadelphia. Laura Monteiro is one of the co-directors there. And this is a kind of ongoing collaborative to look at museum collecting practices in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Penn Museum, their skull collection, things like this. So it's activist focused, and it is kind of radical on the side of community collaboration, turning things over to the community in terms of guiding the project. And then out of Texas, Refusing to Forget, which is an ongoing project to commemorate and research and memorialize anti-Mexican-American violence in Texas. There's a bunch of other things. But let's talk about a few examples. Like I said, I wanted to foreground some of this with a look at what has happened recently in the commemoration of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and some more recent developments there, as a way to, I don't want to use it as like a control or anything like that, but it's a good foundation, because it's probably the most prominent example in the United States right now of memorializing something like this. So 1921, I don't have time to really go into the full history of some of these. I'll mention them briefly. Suffice to say, they're acts of terror. That's what all these things have happened. And they are anti-Black acts of terror by masses of white people. And they had systemic causes and systemic legacies ongoing. And each one has had its own history and path of silencing, memorialization, et cetera, going along with their own road there. So late May 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, a crowd on an elevator downtown interprets interaction between a young Black man and a young white woman as a sexual assault, and the Black man is arrested. And throughout the day, lynch mobs forming downtown Tulsa. And there's also forming a group of Black resistors who come into downtown Tulsa from the Greenwood district just north of downtown, the African-American area, the so-called Black Wall Street, and surround the courthouse to protect the African-American inmate. Someone's gun goes off, and then hell breaks loose over the course of about 2 days. We have, ranged conservatively, well over 100 African Americans killed by the white mob, probably more close to at least 300. and destroys the entire section of Greenwood District. It's a cataclysmic thing. This is not something that's hidden as it's happening. Obviously, this is huge news. There are people coming from different parts of Oklahoma and Arkansas and Missouri to take part in the attacks. But certainly over the course of the next few decades, it will be silenced in very obvious ways. They will literally cut it out of the newspaper archives. And then, of course, within Tulsa and elsewhere in Oklahoma and in the country, the narrative will be presented in a very flat way, if at all. And it's not until not too long ago that we have a flourishing of commemoration, memorialization leading up to the centennial. The centennial, which weekend, which I was at in 2021, there are these overlapping institutional public commemoration efforts funded by the state of Oklahoma, funded by several $1 million from the Bloomberg Foundation. And then there were some more grassroots kind of vernacular events as well. And these things clashed. This was also not long after Donald Trump's visit to Tulsa, which really put a lot of people on edge. And just to give you an example of how things came to a head there in Tulsa for the actual centennial, the state of Oklahoma and the big money supporters of this were to have a big concert at the baseball stadium downtown, right there next to Greenwood. You can't really see it, but there was a huge stage being set up. John Legend was going to be there, everything. This was canceled the day of because an ongoing dispute that the organizers were having with other dissident groups of the commemoration and memorialization, particularly those representing the last, at the time, 3 survivors of the Tulsa Massacre. Of course, the organizers, they were going to have all the celebrities there. They wanted to have the 3 survivors who were very visible this weekend, the centenarians, to be there and come up on stage. And the descendants and their attorneys and the supporters of survivors said no unless you give us X amount of money. And so it came down to it. They said, we're not going to go. So they canceled, kind of out of embarrassment. So this is an ongoing weekend. Here you see the last remaining stretch of Greenwood there with the banner. Like I mentioned, some really prominent things like art exhibits, lots of art in Tulsa, 1921. Some of it very high art, some of it more community art, everywhere in between. Here's an exhibit at the Contemporary Art Gallery there in Tulsa. Crystal Z. Campbell, who is an Oklahoma native, at Harvard right now, commissioned her work where she had gone through the archives and found a cache of photographs from Tulsa circa 1920, and then she has festooned these with shells and beads and kind of given them a postmodern flair as well. So we had things like that. On the more vernacular side here, memorialization. This is not long after the George Floyd summer 2020, which really had a big influence, continues to have a big influence on how these events are commemorated. You can see here, this is an actual installation. This is a floral arrangement. These aren't growing here. These are empty lots in Greenwood. They were not, this particular foundation was not destroyed by the 1921 massacre. It may have been, but then it was rebuilt. This is the rebuilt foundation that was then destroyed by urban renewal in the 1950s and never rebuilt. And this is a very vernacular commemoration, memorialization of George Floyd, and they incorporated that into that. On the left here, hard to make out. These are my photos. Here's one of the survivors, ever present in her memorial Oklahoma City Thunder jersey. Loved her Thunder jersey. And this was the centennial weekend, and they are at the foot of Standpipe Hill in Tulsa, which was a hill where the Oklahoma National Guard mounted some Gatling machine guns. it's murky exactly what the National Guard did or didn't do at that time. So this is a significant space. They are doing a soil collection here to honor the victims. The gentleman here, tall gentleman, he was at the time the Adjutant General of the Oklahoma National Guard. He's a Tulsa native. And he had just delivered a formal apology on behalf of Oklahoma National Guard, which was unauthorized by the governor. And soon after, he was no longer the Adjutant General of the Oklahoma National Guard for a couple of other reasons. So real quick, a spin around the Hallmark Museum for Tulsa called Greenwood Rising. Again, Greenwood is the neighborhood in Tulsa that was destroyed. This is independent, has obviously some civic support. The land was donated by the developer of these lofts over here, so it's part of Greenwood. It's frankly gentrifying. There's a lot of development there. And then the northern part of Greenwood is not. It's bisected by an interstate. So Greenwood Rising opened just after the centennial, just missed it. About a $20–25 million project. Private financing, foundations, this sort of things. It's a relatively small museum and it interprets the race massacre and the legacy. So a quick spin around the museum, give you an insight of that. You enter here, you have an introductory video, short film, made in Tulsa with Tulsans. That is Maya Angelou's "Still I Rise" poem, but in a Tulsa context, right? Both historical and contemporary Tulsa. So that's your introduction, and then you're giving kind of the roots of the area, how Greenwood was founded. You're given a little a slice of life right before the race massacre. You have a large facade that is a black barbershop. And you walk in, and it's a barbershop. And they have these ghostly projections of the barbers who are having a conversation among themselves about what it's like to be black in Tulsa circa 1920. Right? There's some foreshadowing, but it also gives you a picture of the vibrancy of the neighborhood. And you can sit there, get your hair. I think I am. There I am. I was there a couple weeks ago. My haircut guy touching me up there. And then you come out, and then here you are met with a warning. Following galleries contain images, language, and audio that depict racial violence in America. Some resources. And this is kind of an alcove that you walk through. And this picture next to it depicts, as you kind of come around the corner, in fact, here you can see the corner of that sign. This is the room you're walking into. And right there, there's a Klan room. Right, so you're prepared for this by this, but as you walk in, here it is. This is the context for anti-Black terror, both in the United States, but also specifically in Tulsa, before we get to the story of the race massacre itself. The Klan robe, very controversial exhibit. The advisory group for Greenwood Rising, it was being built, consisting of community members, stakeholders, mostly African American. Some have been involved in this type of memory work, really split on whether or not to display the Klan robe. This is the Klan robe actually from Tulsa. Obviously, there were Klan involved in the race massacre leading up to it, the attack itself, and the cover up. And it came down to the director at the time just happened to make the call, and he decided to display the Klan robe. And that was taking some time, I think, to understand to heal some of those divisions. There's some bigger divisions there in Tulsa as well. And then you get the actual information, the interpretation of the massacre itself. Not until then. You've gotten some of the context, timeline, things like this. And then you led into a very large room that has these columns that kind of represent ruins, and projected on these floor-to-ceiling archival images, and then you hear snippets of oral history testimonies from the 1980s of survivors describing the massacre. Right? So it's immersive, it's very emotional, and it is all-encompassing. And you were actually, as a visitor, mostly forced to walk in between the rooms and experience this bodily. And then you get into the sections called survivors and rebuilders. This is the same designer who designed the 9/11 Museum in New York. You've been there. Immediate response, right? A traditional display, map, information, and then some personal stories of survivors, specific survivors and families. And then you're led into a very different gallery that is light. Otherwise, everything's all black with white text, low lighting, except for the text. Here you walk in, it's like this, it's a bright room. It is white with black text, and it focuses on the rebuilding of Greenwood and the vibrant community that it became and still is in many ways, up through the 1990s, early 2000s. So some of the businesses, Gap Band from Tulsa, named after the streets, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. And then you end in this reflective space, becoming very common for these trauma heritage sites, where you're encouraged to sit and think and talk and share. You see it's green, it's kind of round. This is a group from a alternative high school in Norman, Oklahoma, that I was walking around with there. And they had some prompts to talk about. There's prompts that are kind of displayed up here, for you to think about. So you can leave your message there as well. So the relevant points here, the narratives and silences in Tulsa. There's some, mainly it's a conflict with cultural heritage tourism and capitalism, right? The narrative that Black Wall Street was this relatively wealthy, and I guess it was, but there were poor and working class African Americans as well. It wasn't just all upper middle class. That was destroyed. So really kind of foregrounds capitalism. That's caused a little bit of tension within the community as well. And then the way that that the commemoration and memorialization itself has become a piece in cultural heritage tourism in Tulsa, right? The city of Tulsa, to a lesser degree, the state of Oklahoma, really have branded this. And it's strange to think of this as a tourism draw, but it is, right? This is an economic boom for Tulsa as a whole, and specifically as part of Greenwood. So how is that capital recirculated back into the descendant communities? So Black-owned businesses, things like this. It's an ongoing process. There was a lawsuit that was finally ran its course, thrown out among the survivors, those three survivors, and direct descendants of Tulsa race massacre victims, who are essentially seeking to sue the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma to get more of that heritage money that's coming in, that tourism money that's coming. So there's some throughout Tulsa. The great historian John Hope Franklin, probably the greatest African American historian, maybe our greatest historian, U.S. historian as a whole, unbiased. Tulsa native. His father was a survivor of the race massacre attorney, and he is presented prominently. It's kind of an avatar of some of this. Real quick, a quick look at Chicago. A little bit different than what's happening in Tulsa. This is July 1919, the race riots, for the most part, is referred to in Tulsa. And African-American boy, Eugene Williams, and his friends were swimming at segregated beaches on the south side, and they drift across the imaginary race line and are met with a hail of rocks and bricks. One of them hits Eugene Williams and he drowns. And this sets off a full 2 days or so of attacks. 38 people at least killed. Not all Black, white folks as well, both in resistance and also kind of like stray fire, but mostly Black resistance. And in Chicago, again, this is a huge story. In 1919, this is part of the Red Summer. And this was such a huge story that there were state and city commissions that were created to try to understand what were the causes of this. There's some very important work. Ida B. Wells, other people like this were very involved in this. It's a huge deal. But in terms of the commemorative memorial landscape, there's really nothing in Chicago. At the most, you had up until a couple of years ago, a rock at the beach where this happened with a plaque. It was put up by some suburban high schools. I think that was in like 2012. Prior to that, you might read about it. Chicago History Museum might have a couple of panels about it, but no monument, no memorial, no commemorative events, anything like that. As the centennial was coming up, that changed through formation of a couple of nonprofits and some of the places, some of those institutional public places like the Newberry Library, Chicago History Museum, City of Chicago a little bit, not as much as you might think, or maybe you would think, actually put together some centennial programs. So University of Chicago, other places like this. And the one of the grassroots one that grows out of that would be the Chicago Race Riots 1919 Commemoration Committee, imaginatively named. That we'll talk about this. Other things that happened around 2019 and ongoing, a major play at the Steppenwolf, prominent site for theater in the country. They commissioned a adaptation of the sociologist slash poet's Eve Ewing's book 1919, which came out around 2019. Got a lot of notice. They turned this into a play. Kind of I would decide it was kind of an avant-garde. It's very I always say it's a very stepping. Very stepping. Interpreting 1919, kind of a unique. Some other productions as well. Eugene Williams, his grave had been lost. That was found in a marker placed there in just outside of Chicago, or south suburbs. And then other centennial events floated. Right? So this is an act of commemoration, memorialization near the site of where the riot started, where people float out there and join him. This is actually a performance piece by artists. And then, like I mentioned, the Chicago Race Riot 1919 Commemoration Project is really the one that kind of takes hold here. This is pretty grassroots, and it ends up getting quite a bit institutional, but it wasn't planned that way. It is a partnership with places like Organic Oneness, which is a comparative justice community organizing group in Chicago. Firebird Studios, which is a glass blowing studio on the south side that uses basically art therapy for kids and young adults who are impacted by gun violence. They learn how to blow glass. Talk about that. I don't know the whole backstory, but here's Franklin Cozy Gay. He is with the University of Chicago Hospitals. He works in the trauma division. He deals with immediate and ongoing trauma for people who come in to the University of Chicago emergency. So he's a public health professional. And then Peter Cole, who's a historian at Western Illinois University. He is not a public historian, he will tell you. He is a labor historian, but in his off time, hanging out in Berlin, he noticed the Stolperstein markers in the pavement that mark where Jewish victims of the Holocaust lived. It has very simple brass markers and cobblestones, says their name, that type of thing. And Peter was really taken by this. He got to thinking, conversations. There's nothing about 1919. Why don't we do something like that? In Chicago was 1919. One thing led to another through these networks, and then next thing you know, Franklin and Peter are founding this organization. And their concept was to work with Firebird Studios and work with young people, kids and young people who are going through this reparative art project and have them create the markers for the 1919. So essentially these glass blocks, instead of the brass blocks in Berlin, they're going to do kind of glass bricks that commemorate victims, all 38 victims, including white rioters. And those will be embedded in the sidewalk in Chicago where these events. There's some in the loop. There's obviously a lot on the south side. They're spread out over miles. So this is a sprawling commemorative landscape, and they're maybe a sign. This is a great idea. You need a little bit of money for it. They had the buy-in from their community partners, but it takes a lot to get a hole drilled in the sidewalk in Chicago, as you might imagine. So they were going at it. They had some support, had a little bit of financial support, and then July 2020 happens. George Floyd protests, and oftentimes these would turn to memorial landscapes, monuments and statues anywhere in the country that took on that tone of racist tone. In Chicago, that was the Columbus statue. And this was a very tense standoff, attempt to pull the statue down. And then Mayor Lori Lightfoot decided to create the statue up and create a commission to look at, okay, what does the city of Chicago on its property have in terms of problematic monuments, memorials, markers, all that. What do we have? And what are your recommendations, committee, that we should do about this? So one of the things that came up is that it was a silence, like we don't have much 1919 stuff at all. That's strange. Meanwhile, we just had the centennial, and then Peter and Franklin's group and others were kind of poised. There's a big Mellon grant that came in the Chicago Monuments Project that have passed through the city of Chicago, and several projects received funding to do the memorial work that they had posed. One of those being Franklin Peters' group of Chicago's, right? Mission 1919. So now they are able to actually install some things. They installed their first piece in just this summer. Right, there's the marker, and you can see here are bricks close up there. This is the one from Gene Williams. This is right there by this 35th and Bronze. So the relevant points here. Chance to land on screen. The landscape, what's the memorial landscape look like? Right, is it a traditional marker, monument, statue? Or in this case, is it spread out over the city? I mentioned some narrative choices that they're making in terms of who they commemorate and how they commemorate them. And then it specifically comes out of a reparative framework, working with those young adults and organizations that are doing trauma work. This is an add-on, it comes out of that. It's an active commemoration. Here is the annual bike tour, goes to the south side across these sites. Franklin directing traffic there. And for the most part, the city of Chicago and the big institutions have been relatively hands-off here. We'll see if that remains the case. And how does this impact ideas of tourism? It's not really an idea like economic development that we see in Tulsa. So we'll end with Ellie's in the Springfield. August 1908. Black man accused of raping the white woman who falls asleep. Another black man in jail at the time. Black men were threatened by a lynch mob and taken out of town. The white mob is mad, so they tear up the black part of town and lynch 2 black men. We have at least 11 deaths. 4 African Americans. The 2 men, William Donegan, Scott Burton, lynched. Samuel Payne, a 3-week-old baby boy who dies exposure as his parents are fleeing out by Pittsfield. And then Joe James, who is hanged under very questionable circumstances for a crime that he may have committed, but certainly not to the degree where he deserved a hang. So, the long story of commemoration or lack thereof in Springfield. This is, again, a big deal in 1908. Becomes much less of a deal throughout the decades. But certainly by the 1970s, there's an increased interest, primarily coming out of the work of Colin Davis and some others here sang in the state. The Oral History Project, Springfield Oral History Project in the 1970s. Courtney here knows all about this. Compiled something like 94 pages of snippets of people talking about the race riot itself. So these are spread out across thousands of pages, dozens of interviews. Luckily, it's word searchable. We have dozens of Black Springfield folks in the 1970s recalling the 1908 race riot, 94 some pages of that. And there's some other city commissions in the 70s, some discussions about a statue or something like that. They don't really go anywhere. The first literature about it, 1973, a local journalist writing for the Historical Society, kind of drawing on newspaper footage, writes really the first comprehensive account of the riot itself in 1973. First scholarly work, really the only full scholarly work at this point, by sociologists, Roberta Snickle Del Roche. Later republished as In Lincoln's Shadow. And then markers are finally put up in 1994. See the old style of marker here, I think 11 of them, different areas of riots and the lynchings, and then replaced up for the centennial in 2008. This has been replaced again. Centennial, the famous renaming honorary Reconciliation Way, 11th Street, you can see today. And then Acts of Intolerance sculpture by Preston Jackson, installed in 2009 across from the Presidential Library Museum. Other key points that gets us where we are today, a railroad project that you all know. Since this was federally funded, it required the city of Springfield and Union Pacific and the Federal Railroad Administration and the engineers on this project to undergo what they call Section 106 consultation mitigation. Anytime a federal funds are used for a project that could potentially impact the historical resource, things have to slow down. There has to be a community consultation, and the feds and the people who are doing this have to take into account community consultation. So it was no surprise that there were foundations from the 1908 race riot on the site. Right. It was a surprise the degree they were intact. The mitigation is the federal government says, yes, we're paying to destroy these historical resources. It's going to happen. What can we do to kind of make it up? That's the mitigation. There was not much mitigation. They moved the tracks about 15 feet to go around some of them. And then they did a full archaeological recovery dig on some of the foundations and covered the rest. And preserve it. So that's Leroy Jordan, late Leroy Jordan, former UIS administrator, at the 2019 archaeological open house, holding a rifle case that was recovered from. And then culminate here with the establishment of the 1908 Springfield 1908 race riot National Historic Monument, National Park Service, designated stroke of the pen by President Biden in August 2024. This came after several years of studies by the National Park Service, recommending this for use of the sites here. And then this was the ceremony in October. We already had this is the Park Service group. There's also a group that we got similar to Stratton, local city councilors, everything like that. This is just the Park Service crew there, and they are here smiling next to the sign that says large white mob attacked Black communities. Then I'll conclude with, is there an emerging consensus narrative for the Springfield race riots? Yes, there are important exceptions. One is that a lot of focus on the key well-known victims, the two lynching victims, primarily, and then vaguely the white mob. The white mob does this. The white mob does. Now, when you're commemorating something, memorializing, you've only got a few words. There's going to be some flattening of it, but it'll be interesting to see how the Park Service and other places that are working here. The length of context. Important for why the race riot here became such a big deal as it did. Right away was a Lincoln context, so that's going to remain. Focus on ruins and refugees, kind of victimology here, and then the founding of the NAACP. Almost not a redemptive quality, but something that comes out of the ashes. Founding the NAACP in reaction to this violence. There are some notable silences here, with exceptions that I'll point. Joe James, that inmate who is executed in October after the race riot, under very flimsy evidence. He had been, the judge had been threatened with another race riot if they didn't hang him. That's a tough thing to interpret. So that, you don't hear a lot about Joe James in the official emerging public memory. Again, implicated subjects beyond just the white mob. What were the systemic factors and legacies of this violence? These kind of just pop up out of nowhere, and then there's ruins. The stories of Black resistance. Several white people were killed by Black people defending their homes and their families and businesses. Right. That is an important story, but you can see how it's a little difficult to maybe kind of wedge into this. Long-term aftermath as well. There's a lot of research needs to be done in terms of the economic impact, intergenerational. How many people left, how many people came back, all these things. There's a lot of actual history. And then Sonia Massey, who was murdered in July of the summer, just as these conversations about the designation, the national monument. Right. So this kind of juxtaposition. And these two narratives, maybe the two biggest stories, happen in Springfield in some time. Happen concurrently, they don't really match up in the public memory so far. When you go to the National Park Service dedication, no one mentions Sonia Massey. There was one sort of implied reference to Sonia Massey, but you only would have heard it if you were listening for it. That was. Otherwise, no one mentions Sonia Massey. Sonia Massey is a descendant of a Donegan. Her family, she's a direct descendant of the 1980s. Right. So sometimes if you're in the Massey memorialization, community organizing world, you'll hear references to 1908, but it doesn't really work the other way. So I'll end there with just, skip that for now. What's next in Tulsa? The Beyond Apology Commission, official name of the commission. City of Tulsa, here the mayor, G.T. Bynum, Republican, with a Black city council member. And this is a commission to come up with a framework that goes beyond apology. It's reparations. The mayor just came out straight up and said it. It's a straight shooter, said, I'm not going to call it reparations, but it's reparations, or a reparative framework in terms of funding for direct descendants of Tulsa that is ongoing. Chicago, they got 35 some other markers to put in. I'll mention the Journeys to Justice project that Lisa Johnson and I and Peter Cole and Tandra Taylor from Edwardsville, East St. Louis are working on to try to share resources among Chicago, East St. Louis, Springfield, other places who are memorializing anti-Black terror. We've gotten a good toehold with some of the folks up in Chicago, so we're looking forward to hearing from them. And then Springfield is just a potpourri of institutions and organizations that are all on a different path here. Park Service is obviously the big one, with their interpretive plan and their appropriations will be coming in the next couple of years. What will the visitor center look like? What will the memorial interpretation look like? Here's our other Journeys to Justice program. Springfield Equal Justice Project, working with Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, maybe. African American History Museum has a grant to redo, to really create a 1908 permanent exhibit that Brian Mitchell here and I and other people are working on. State Museum has the contract to create an interpretive display at the new county transportation hub that will open in 2020 or so. And then Brian and the history department, myself and our grad assistant Courtney, and then Jake Freefield, Center for Lincoln Studies, and his graduate assistant Anna, and Michaela who is working in the department as well. We are working on a big database project. Brian compiled a list of 1,800 names of African Americans who lived in Springfield in 1908. And we are tracing them before and after in time for engagement. So I'll let you a few minutes, questions, comments. Thoughts? Go back.
Devin, this is Hinda. Are you all hearing me?
Yeah, I hear you, Linda.
Hey, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just thinking of how much UIS could do. For instance, I don't think we do we have a professor who specializes in African American history these days?
No, not
We don't.
traditionally speaking.
And our AAS.
I'll do, history of African America, all of our courses, but no, we do not have a faculty member who I'll call a African American student.
And our AAS minor is struggling, I
We're
believe,
trying.
because of the how few faculty we have at UIS who specialize in African American studies. But anyway, I had a question for you. We may have chatted about this already, but I remember going to an event where a Black woman faculty member said, I wouldn't want to be walking down the street and see a monument to lynching. That would be traumatic for
Mhm.
me. And I recently was talking with a curator at Northwestern University, their museum, and I'm sure they had a big exhibit on African American violence and things like that. And they were so thoughtful and careful about trauma and, how to not subject people to trauma through the exhibit. So I guess I'm just wondering, since I'm really interested in public monuments, what is the thinking about, how you commemorate or monumentalize without especially traumatizing Black people walking down the street and, possibly confronting these monuments.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's one thing to have this in the museum, like I showed at Greenwood, and there's a lot of these museums of trauma that obviously people are going to come to, mostly expecting it, and then there's spaces, trigger warnings and spaces to process. I know it's coming, but it's another thing, like you said, Hinda, to where it is right there in the streets, right? And I don't know there's a good model out there in terms of major public visible commemorations of trauma. They're usually again kind of behind closed doors. The ones I'm thinking of are pretty abstract in terms of how they depict the historical events. All right, so that's part of it. Good question.
I did want to thank you so much, not only for your presentation, but your extraordinary work that I really feel does UIS proud. So thank you so much.
Appreciate that. Yeah, well, do what we can, and there's a kind of historical context to the campus, mixed record in terms of community engagement, both broadly but also specifically in this case. There's a lot of work to be done in Springfield, one of the most segregated cities in the country, particularly when you map that onto income. Right, there are not many places in the country that have that start level of both racial and economic disparity, and that has just come from nowhere as well. So it'll be interesting to see how 1908 does and doesn't get part of that narrative. Really?
And I would also really thank you for this presentation. I just learned a lot, and this was great. So I've been trying to follow the 1908 commemoration. One of the things that really strikes me, and you've talked about this, is how we have a lot of official commemoration now in Springfield.
Right.
What do you think some of the areas where, for some ongoing projects, that have potential for bringing in work and highlighting community voice in a
Mhm.
more you think?
Yeah, the two, one, the Illinois State Museum and their work with the exhibit in the county building. That's been based off of almost 2 years now of community consultation with direct descendants and more broadly speaking, descendant communities. And I think that they've tried to focus on that. How do we get beyond just a presentation for the people? How do we make it more of an ongoing, impactful thing? The Equal Justice Project ideal is to do some of that work to not just put a marker up, kind of an ongoing thing. One of the important parts of some of this work from a public history standpoint is like the ideas of active commemoration, memorialization, where you do something every year. So you don't, so whether it's the bike ride or Ruth Sergels' famous project in New York City that creates chalkings every year for the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, right? You have to come out and do it in order to keep the memory. So I think that's the opening to have maybe more impactful, engage with the community, and not engage with the community like, here's what do you guys think of the marker, or what do you guys think of the mind of what we're doing? Not to deal, but like something that is built from the community, for the community, that is ongoing, and engages with the contemporaries.
Hi, Devin. There is a question from the Zoom room from Ann Mosley.
Yeah.
Hey, Devin, thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, I haven't really heard too much about the new head of the Springfield Equal Justice Project. Has there someone been picked for that?
The Equal Justice Project, primarily formed or just part of to put forward Springfield as a partner with the Equal Justice Initiative through the Community Remembrance Project. And since then, there has been a lot of activity. We're waiting to hear back from Equal Justice. So it's not a hiatus, but it's kind of pause, waiting for the next step. So certainly an organization's in transition.
Okay. And then the other question I had for you is, we've been working with the African American History Museum on recording the legacy of the riots through people who live on the east side, and working on trying to save some of the historic sites within the Springfield area that are related to Black history on the east side. So one of the questions I have for you is, have you seen any work done in Tulsa in connection to working with city councils on trying to build up the areas that have been really neglected due to the riots that have taken place?
Yeah, that's a big part of the Beyond Apology Commission, because so many resources were poured into Greenwood Rising and that kind of 1 or 2 block area that has the remnants of Greenwood. And you have an entire 2 square miles north that is really neglected. So I think that is like, I looked up the charge of that commission specifically to talk about grants and loans to Black business, which is part of the Greenwood Rising initiative, that area. But that went to a very small number of business owners. So they're trying to expand that. So for sure, that's the rhetoric at least. And it'll come down to funding and sustainability of that project.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a great presentation, learned a ton. Thinking about other sort of commemorative tourism, one thing that I don't know, are there like iconic artifacts and that become commoditized or that people latch onto that like stick in the memory that
It's like
can
a
help,
relic.
that could,
Yeah.
yeah, that people's
Right.
memories or of the event can, or
Right.
the forest people's
Right,
goat, like solidifies their memories around.
right,
And, you know, it's like, it looked like in the Tulsa pictures you showed, it was a lot of photographs and a lot of sort of abstract stuff.
right.
And so I'm just, you know, what we did, we had these excavations, the
Yeah.
bricks in Chicago seem really iconic to me.
Right.
And are those, can those be like sort of a sort of like magnets or
Right.
ways of sort of directing attention and building, you know, using the sort of the commodity aspect of like an iconic artifact to build memory or to build
Yeah,
fundraising or I don't know, it just sort of,
right,
it just seemed like a little,
yeah,
are there these iconic artifacts, I guess, is the question that would become relics or.
yeah, that's a good point. That's one of the challenges with commemorating these, well, like these events, is that so much was purposely erased. So in the case of Springfield, archaeological excavations pulled up some interesting things. I think there's something iconic they can really hold on to and highlight. The question of, you know, how would you create a museum exhibit? Things that come out of the ground, photographs. Tulsa, again, you know, there are a couple of foundations left. That's about it. The entire place was just white. So they, you know, they have a challenge with brand. Springfield, I think it'll be interesting to see how the Park Service does that. Right now, they're just using a lot of historical photos for the Park Service website. You just have photos, historical photos. Usually they want to have kind of like a little brand. And I don't know what that would be. Yeah, the idea of the relic. Yeah, man.
Kind of questions. How do you get this to be more well known in Springfield?
Mhm.
And how could you like, you know, every school goes to like,
Right,
could you like get that to be a part of curriculum, like
right.
to that museum?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great way to do it. There's no, this has come up before in, you go way back to the city council discussions in the 70s, the 80s, and 90s about the race riot. There's been talked about, you know, can we have, you know, at least District 186 make this part of the curriculum, and it's not. And other places have, you know, a little bit of success with that. Certainly the idea of the field trip to a site and having an exhibit where you have American History Museum or transportation hub, or park service, or whatever. There's going to be lots of opportunities that I think will be geared towards school age kids. Right, it's a matter of finding those kind of resources to get people to go, and it would be great to mandate it. Like you said, I think that's probably a education policy question as much as anything. That's where you got me. Yeah, Colin.
Certainly, probably, David, Harrison, you, but coming from the class, and I had a contemporary art class a couple hours ago, and we were shifting into, another beat of, a lot of the things we were looking at. Were the, you know, the school. Well, I could be off the mark here, but I was curious if that is kind of a trend that, monuments and race riots and race massacres kind of have to rely on milestones.
Yeah.
Instead of virtue of
Right. It's a good point. You know, the
Dr.
yeah, particularly centennials.
Dr. Hunter, could you please repeat the questions and the Zoom
Yes, sure.
could not hear
Yeah,
it? Thank you.
I want to ask about the significance of like centennials in particular years that and how some of these events and you know the history of this and the commemoration are kind of dependent on having these big year markers. I think that's a really good point because yes, and it's see where some of the narratives change in terms of visibility. It's around the centennial usually. certainly happened in Springfield, 2008, and when the centennial happens. So the idea, again, the commemoration, the memorialization is going to be a lot about what is happening at that time, as well as the history it's interpreting. What was happening in 2008 in Springfield for the centennial, right? Obama, right? Things like that. If that centennial were to happen now, it would be very different. 2021 in Tulsa was a pretty heavy time to be doing this community work. So yeah, the idea of the opportunity for community members and public historians and other memory workers to maybe get noticed when they don't, but it also kind of limits you to what is happening that evening. Good point.
Dr. Hunter, we have several comments in the chat room, just kind of thanking you for your presentation.
Great, appreciate it. I kind of skimmed through the chat there, and if there's nothing else, thank you all. Thanks everyone on Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter.
And you all know how to find me. To talk more. So there's a lot ongoing, emerging, particularly in Springfield. If you want to get involved, I can at least tell you to talk. Great. Thank you all.